Today we're going to view boundaries in relationships through a Stoic lens. Boundaries are not walls, they are healthy lines that clarify how you will and will not allow others to treat you. Stoicism emphasizes self-control, reason, and leading a virtuous life. This can be incredibly useful for building significant, rewarding relationships. Here are 5 key boundaries inspired by Stoicism. 1. Your time and energy are valuable. It's okay to turn down someone who drains you or doesn't align with your priorities. An example of how a Stoic would value their responsibilities would be taking proper care of themselves. Imagine a Stoic who followed the same philosophy as Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. His duties as the ruler of an empire were enormous. Still, Stoicism helps us to prioritize our responsibilities. For Aurelius, that meant ruling with efficiency. But it also meant looking after his physical and mental needs. To make wise decisions for the empire, he required all of his energy and concentration. Like Aurelius, you have responsibilities related to your work, family, and personal health. Saying no lets you successfully complete your main responsibilities. It doesn't make you selfish. Learn to say no firmly and politely when someone asks something that drains your energy or doesn't fit in with your priorities. Describe the situation and, if you can, offer a substitute. Consider your energy and time as bandwidth. There's a limit, just like with internet bandwidth. You will experience burnout and overwhelm if you continuously overcommit to more than you can handle. You can reserve bandwidth for the things that really matter by establishing boundaries. This guarantees that you can participate fully and offer your all in those domains. Recognize the people and things that sap your energy. Are there any social settings where you feel exhausted? Do some tasks seem too big for you to handle? After you've identified these energy-sucking activities, look into ways to reduce them. Perhaps assign responsibilities, cut down on social events, or establish self-care practices to refuel. Taking care of oneself is not a luxury, it is a need. You must invest in yourself, just as a car needs routine maintenance to run properly. Make energy-replenishing activities a priority, such as exercise, yoga, and enjoyable hobbies. You'll have more energy to devote to your relationships and obligations if you look after yourself. 2. Clearly communicate what you need. Stoicism appreciates clear communication. Therefore, your partner can't just magically know what you need. When what you need is expressed, they will be more likely to understand, and there will be less possibility for conflict. It's unrealistic to expect your partner to be a mind reader. If you have a need or expectation, voice it directly and openly. This might feel uncomfortable at first, but it fosters understanding and reduces the likelihood of misunderstandings and resentment. Instead of accusatory statements that start with "you," use "I" statements to express your needs. For example, instead of saying, "You never help with chores," try, "I feel overwhelmed when I'm solely responsible for housework. Can we discuss sharing the chores?" This approach focuses on your feelings and highlights the desired outcome. Clear communication is a two-way street. When your partner expresses a need, practice active listening. This means paying full attention, acknowledging their feelings, and asking clarifying questions. Active listening demonstrates respect and helps ensure you truly understand their perspective. Once you've both communicated your needs openly, explore common ground. Can you compromise or find a solution that works for both of you? Be open to different approaches and willing to adjust your expectations if necessary. A collaborative spirit fosters a stronger relationship. Remember, communication is an ongoing process. Needs and expectations may evolve over time. Regularly check in with your partner and express any changes you experience. This helps maintain understanding and prevents future conflict. 3. Don't be a doormat. Stoicism teaches us to live with integrity, and that means respecting ourselves as well as others. Imagine being in a relationship where someone is constantly making inconsiderate requests or saying things that disrespect you. Maybe a friend keeps borrowing money without paying you back, or a partner expects you to drop everything whenever they need something. This can be a tough situation. On one hand, you don't want to rock the boat. On the other hand, constantly being taken advantage of can leave you feeling resentful and undervalued. So, how can you stand up for yourself without creating unnecessary conflict? Stoicism encourages us to express ourselves calmly and assertively. This doesn't mean yelling or getting aggressive. Instead, it involves clearly stating your boundaries in a respectful way. For example, if a friend keeps borrowing money, you might say, "Hey, I'm happy to help out sometimes. but I can't keep lending you money I need myself. Maybe we can talk about a repayment plan for what you already owe. When addressing an issue, focus on the specific behavior that bothers you, not personal attacks. Instead of saying, "You're so inconsiderate for asking me to drop everything," try, "I feel frustrated when plans change last minute. Can we try to give each other more notice in the future?" This approach is more likely to lead to a positive outcome. Remember, the goal isn't to punish your partner or friend, but to find a solution that works for everyone. Be open to discussing alternatives and working together to create a more balanced dynamic. Perhaps your friend can offer something else in exchange for borrowing money, or your partner can commit to helping out more around the house. Setting boundaries doesn't mean you don't care about the other person. In fact, it's a sign of respect for yourself and the relationship. By communicating your needs clearly, you create a foundation for a healthier, more balanced connection. Standing up for yourself can feel awkward at first, but the more you practice, the easier it becomes. Start small and gradually build your confidence in assertive communication. You'll be surprised at how much better you feel when you prioritize your own well-being and respect within your relationships. 4. Take a breath, separating your emotions for clear communication. Stoicism emphasizes responding rationally, and that can be a challenge in the heat of the moment. Imagine you're having a disagreement with your partner. They say something that upsets you, and your initial reaction might be to lash out in anger or frustration. However, Stoicism teaches us to take a step back and process our emotions before reacting. Why? Because reacting purely on emotion can lead to saying things we regret or shutting down productive communication. Here's the thing, emotions are natural. It's okay to feel angry, hurt, or frustrated. The key is to recognize those emotions and not let them control your response. The next time you feel a surge of anger, try hitting a mental pause button. Take a few deep breaths, count to 10, or excuse yourself to take a short break. This brief pause allows your emotions to cool down a bit, creating space for a more measured response. Sometimes, certain situations or words trigger strong emotional reactions in us. By understanding your triggers, you can be more proactive in managing them. For example, maybe your partner has a tendency to make jokes that come across as insensitive. Once you recognize this pattern, you can have a calm conversation about how their humor affects you. Stoicism encourages approaching situations with reason. Once you've calmed down and processed your emotions, try to understand the situation logically. What caused the disagreement? What are your underlying feelings? Considering these questions can help you formulate a more constructive response. Instead of blaming statements that start with "you," use "I" statements to express your feelings. For example, instead of saying, "You're always so inconsiderate," try, "I feel hurt when you make those jokes because they come across as mean-spirited." This approach focuses on how you feel and opens the door for a more empathetic conversation. The goal is to communicate effectively and find a resolution. Once you've calmed down and processed your emotions, you can approach your partner with an open mind. Share your perspective and be willing to listen to theirs. By communicating honestly and respectfully, you can navigate disagreements in a healthier way. 5. Focus on what you can control. One of the core principles of Stoicism is focusing on what you can control. This can be especially helpful in relationships, where another person's actions and emotions can sometimes feel unpredictable. Imagine you and your partner are having a disagreement. They say something hurtful, and your first instinct might be to try to control the situation, to make them apologize or see things your way. The problem? You can't control someone else's response. You can't force them to feel or act differently, but what you can control is your own reaction. A Stoic approach would be to take a step back and focus on how you choose to respond. Instead of blaming your partner for making you angry or upset, acknowledge that your emotions are your responsibility. You can't control what triggers them, but you can control how you react. By taking ownership of your emotions, you empower yourself to choose a more constructive response. Stoicism teaches us to focus on our own behavior rather than dwelling on what someone else is doing. Instead of obsessing over your partner's actions, ask yourself, how can I respond in a way that aligns with my values and preserves my self-respect? Perhaps it means calmly expressing your feelings, setting a boundary, or simply taking some time to cool down before engaging further. Sometimes, the best course of action is to let go. This doesn't mean giving up on the relationship or condoning bad behavior. It simply means accepting that you can't control the other person and choosing to focus your energy on things you can control, your own thoughts, words, and actions. Setting healthy boundaries isn't about controlling others, it's about protecting your own well-being. Boundaries allow you to maintain a sense of self-respect and avoid feeling drained or taken advantage of in a relationship. By setting clear boundaries and focusing on your own behavior, you create a foundation for a more balanced and fulfilling connection. Even though you can't control your partner's actions, you can always communicate your needs and expectations. Open and honest communication is essential for building trust and understanding in any relationship. By focusing on your own response and communicating clearly, you can create a more positive dynamic within your partnership. Setting boundaries can feel daunting at first. Maybe you worry about hurting someone's feelings or rocking the boat. But trust me, the rewards are worth it. Here's why. Imagine a life where you're constantly pulled in different directions, constantly saying yes even when you want to say no. Boundaries free you from that burden. They allow you to prioritize your well-being and create space for the things that truly matter in your life. Healthy boundaries don't push people away, they create a foundation for stronger connections. When you set clear boundaries, you show respect for yourself and your needs. This honesty and authenticity ultimately attract people who value you for who you are, not what they can get from you. Unhealthy boundaries often lead to resentment. You might feel taken advantage of or unheard. Setting boundaries can prevent these feelings. When you communicate your needs clearly, you're less likely to bottle up frustrations that can erupt into conflict later. Respecting your boundaries sends a powerful message to yourself. It says, my time, energy, and well-being are valuable. This self-respect naturally boosts your confidence and self-esteem, leading to a more fulfilling life overall. When you're constantly stretched thin and feeling disrespected, it's hard to find peace. Setting boundaries allows you to create a sense of calm and control in your life. You'll have more mental space to focus on what truly matters and cultivate a sense of serenity in your relationships. So, take a deep breath and start setting those boundaries. It might not be easy at first, but the results will be worth it. You'll find yourself living a life that's more fulfilling, more authentic, and ultimately, more peaceful. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content on Stoicism.